Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jean, the Digital Event Coordinator at Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. We are part of the Info Exchange Group, a not-for-profit social enterprise that tackles the biggest social challenges by creating use of technology. For those of you who haven't attended a webinar sections with us before, Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand facilitate training calendars of online calendars, workshops, boot camps, and webcons to help social sector facilitate in all digital areas. So please check out our training menu on our website for more events coming up. Today, I'm very excited to welcome you to join what you need to know when it comes to compliance, obligation, and accreditation checks with Cecilia and Claire. So Cecilia is the practice leader at Moores, and Claire is the CEO at OHO, and they will talk about themselves very soon. Before we begin, we'll start with a bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any technical issues, please type into the questions box and I'll be here to assist you. If you have any questions during the webinar, please also type into the box, and Claire, Cecilia will get them answered by the end of the webinar. We really encourage you to ask as many questions as possible to make it very interactive. And please note that your comments and questions will not be up here to the entire group. And please also note that the webinar is being recorded. The link to the recording and also the slides will be sent to you in 1 to 2 business days. Finally, I would like to remind you there's a very short survey at the end of the webinar. Please help us to complete that for an even better experience in the future. All right, so now I'll pass on to Cecilia and Claire for today's section. Thank you.
Oh, well, welcome everyone. It's great to have you here working and exploring together with us this important topic, and it is definitely a topic that many organisations overlook and don't pay enough attention to, and we've learnt a lot about that over our time as we've brought the OHO solution to life. And so today's a really important day for you, and we hope that we're able to give you a lot more insight into why this is such an important control to stamp out opportunities for abuse and for malpractice. I'm the CEO and co-founder of OHO. My background is in banking and digital, in particular digital services. And then I was also the CEO of World Vision. So I've got that blend of how to use technology to create fantastic social impact. And so I'm delighted to be here with you today to share our knowledge, but I'm also thrilled that Cecilia has joined us to assist in the legal and the governance aspects of this area and provide a perspective too on how you might respond to some of the legal changes that are in play at the moment and also some that are coming up. Cecilia, would you like to just introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, you may already know me, but if you don't, I'm a practice leader at Moores. I've been at Moores for almost 20 years. I was reflecting to Claire, it seems like it's been not nearly as long, but it would be fair to say in that time that the legal changes in this area have just been immense. So I've been a practice leader, a partner at Moores for about 10 years, and my role is to head up our education section, but we at Moores more broadly work with lots of not-for-profits and help them navigate, I suppose, compliance when we don't have an unlimited amount of time, and we certainly don't have an unlimited amount of money in the not-for-profit sector, but it would be fair to say that legal expectations are higher than ever, and there's pretty much no excuse for failure, and we know, don't we, Claire, that where there's a failure, it can be indeed some very catastrophic outcomes for young people, for people who are vulnerable. So there is a bit of scary content in here. We'll talk a bit about the law, but really keen to explore with you, Claire, some solutions for those issues too.
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. That's a great segue. So let me just go through the agenda. That the problem we're looking at Hopefully the slides will move. Thanks, Mel. The problem we're looking at is that organisations should be verifying worker credentials regularly after onboarding staff. You know, when I talk about onboarding, I mean recruitment, all that stuff that we do up front, and that is done reasonably well in Australia. But we're not verifying worker credentials beyond that onboarding experience, partly because it's been too hard and it's been a huge compliance burden amongst many others to administer. But by not doing it, we're leaving openings for people who are or become unsuitable to have access to the vulnerable. I talk about it, it's like the basic foundation of child safety. No brilliant training program in child safety is going to be adhered to if you have someone who has malintent in your organisation. So let's shut the door, not let them be in the first place, and keep monitoring to make sure they don't become unsuitable. And then our training programs and child safety initiatives will have the greatest impact. So what we'll cover today is the common accreditation obligations, a deep dive into the working with children check accreditation compliance requirements. OHO actually started from the inspiration of a survivor who courageously shared his testimony at the Royal Commission, and our organisation was with him as he did that, and they heard other testimonies as well, and came back to talk about how could technology make our workplaces, make our organisations where children and the vulnerable come together be safer. And so that was our inspiration. We'll also cover the penalties and implications, some common myths about people thinking that they're already covered, and I'll explain why those are myths. And then we'll have a look at the OHO risk mitigation opportunity to take our service, and we will share with you, you do get a special deal through connecting up. So I do encourage you to have a look at that closely, and then we'll take some Q&A. So that's the agenda. There's quite a bit in here. We will go through it, but we're also available for questions at any time. You can come and chat to us in more depth on these matters. Okay. So accreditation compliance, industries and obligations, welfare, aged care, disability, education, faith, health, sporting, community and government all require for people working in those sectors accreditations to assess their suitability to work. And this is a phrase that the law and I think the Office of Children's Guardians use a lot, this suitability criteria. The accreditations that we cover or are coming in OHO but are relevant to all these industries, you'd be familiar with them. We think we've got a reasonably comprehensive list here, but there are many. Working with children checks, and remember they're different in each state across Australia. Teachers' licenses similarly. Allied health professionals registration. Those accreditations cover all the medical boards right through from allied health like physiotherapy to surgeons and nursing staff. The new accreditation on the block is the National Disability Worker Check. VIVOs, the right to work in this country, police checks, all have a role to play in determining someone's suitability to work. And then there are some general responsibilities, general accreditations that aren't actually verifiable, but are still important in certain contexts. First aid, responsible serving of alcohol, and of course, more recently, the COVID vaccination. So that's the context of the accreditation compliance. Now I'll hand over to Cecilia. This is the deep dive where we'll look specifically at working with children checks, but many of the issues and areas we explore here do apply in some form or modification in those other accreditations as well. Thanks, Cecilia.
So we have to perhaps just pause for a second and consider why these checks have been implemented. Claire referred, of course, before to the Royal Commission. There have been multiple Royal Commissions, but the one that we find ourselves referring to extensively is the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. The really important point about the name of that Royal Commission is it's about the institutions. So it was an analysis of where failures had been effectively done by organisations who should have done better. Sometimes there was malice involved, but very often it was simply a failure of knowing how to have adequate oversight over people who represented a threat. And what we've seen is we've moved from a landscape where we operated on trust, certain people were trusted and certain people were not, to a much more mature understanding of child safety in particular and about vulnerable people generally, which is 90% of abuse is opportunistic. So if we leave the session today understanding that our role is to prevent opportunity, we've already resolved 90% of the problem. So 90% of abuse is opportunistic. Let's remove the opportunity. Some of the other work that we do, our firm, of course, may refer to if something has in fact happened and someone has taken an opportunity to attempt to groom a child, for example, and that's when we come back to other tools in the toolkit. But this is the key thing that we start with, which is understanding who we need to check. And we need to check any person who is involved in child-related work. That includes electronic communications with a child. You don't have to be meeting with a child to meet this definition. We now have, with effect from July, a supercharged set of child safe standards here in Victoria and a new ministerial order for schools that also takes effect in July. And it very much recognises that the online landscape, particularly when you consider the amount of remote learning, etc., that's taking place, must be part of your considerations in this area. I'll have the next slide. Thank you, Mel. So it would be fair to say, wasn't it clear that organisations often don't know where to start and what their obligations are? I don't want to overgeneralise, but I think one of the problems we sometimes see is there's probably an underestimation. Would you agree, Claire, with what the obligations are?
Yeah.
So if you are working with children in any way, shape or form, whether as a volunteer or as a not-for-profit, the starting point is assume you are covered by the scheme based on that definition that was on the previous slide. There is no allowance in the law for not-for-profits or smaller organisations which have volunteers to have an exemption. If you work with kids, you are covered. So you cannot have any person working with you if they do not meet the working with children requirements. And there is a check there, and I know something you're going to talk about too, Claire, later, is checking at the onboarding stage is just step one. If I can say what the second assumption is that we see, if the first one is we don't understand or we underestimate our obligations, the second assumption we see probably is that the job is done. We've checked, they've onboarded, and now we can set and forget. And I think we know, and you're going to refer to later, Claire, that that's not something that we can tolerate. In fact, it introduces risk of which many people are largely unaware. Mel, if you don't mind moving to the next one, thanks. We've set out on here really just the 4 key steps you need to follow. Often when we're starting this conversation, it's where do I start? So assuming for the purposes of this part of the presentation, you understand that you have to get a check, you first of all have to understand which checks you need to get, and then that they are verified. Secondly, mitigating against that issue I've articulated around set and forget, we need to be in a position to actively monitor those accreditations. So understand if they expire, or, and I think I don't want to steal Claire's thunder, she'll talk to you about ways in which we can lose oversight of some of our staff or our volunteer accreditations. Thirdly, it needs to be part of your risk strategy. So your board has a non-delegible duty to actually consider these matters at the board level. It's not satisfactory, and this is all embedded in the child safe standards, or in the case of the education area, the ministerial order, that the board itself must have oversight of this and must understand what risk mitigation tools are in place. Lastly, you need to have accurate records for reporting. And we're not just talking about reporting of checks, we're talking about reporting of incidents, investigations, and having policies and procedures that you can refer to and point to. Documentation is key if there should ever be an incident as well. Thanks, Mel. Now, we said it would be some scary content. I think it's worth knowing, we've already referred to your board having a non-deliverable duty. Obviously, we're worried about preventing child abuse because there really is no cure. Prevention must indeed in this area be our cure. But apart from that, we also need to have absolutely transparent conversations about the fact that people can go to jail. There are offences in the state of Victoria which apply, for example, a failure to protect. So if you are in a position where you have an obligation to protect a child, so you're on a board, for example, and you fail to do that, and whether that's deliberate or by omission, there is potentially jail time there. Similarly, there's an offence in the state of Victoria which is called failure to disclose. That is if you become aware that there has been sex abuse committed, but you do not report it. Again, jail time, it's a criminal offence. And I'm sure you'd appreciate that these offences I've referred to come absolutely from the findings of that Royal Commission I referenced earlier, which is to say that organisations failed individuals in not only failing to prevent it, but then not doing adequate follow-up, reporting, etc. once it was discovered. It's probably beyond this seminar to go into detail. One of the challenges we have in Australia is that we have a whole bunch of state jurisdictions. They are all different. I've referred to 2 of the offences in Victoria. The other probably notable one for our purposes is the offence of grooming. Grooming is an offence where someone attempts to create a relationship either with a child or a child's family for the purposes of escalating that trust situation to committing abuse. The take-home point about grooming is that it is considered a crime even if the ultimate sexual abuse never occurs. The act of facilitating and bringing about an intimate relationship for that abuse to occur is the offence itself. And that's why, Claire, isn't it so important that part of your checks don't let that conduct start off before it can lead to escalation.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mel. So just a few examples on the screen. We talked about failures of organisations. Here's a few areas you can be pinged on under the Working with Children legislation. So you employ someone who doesn't have a Working with Children check when they're required to have one. You cannot employ people who are already disqualified in relation to child-related work, probably because of something they've done historically. Don't forget that board members and senior execs also need to have a Working with Children check. I'm on a school board. I absolutely need to have one. I also need to be triple vaccinated, just a little segue there. You have to have evidence that you have checked Working with Children checks and you've kept a record that you have done so. So even if you've got them, if you can't prove that you have verified them, you might be in trouble there. Again, if you then have such inadequate records that when you're held to account, you can't meaningfully respond to the regulator, another penalty will apply. So this is kind of a, you don't get any leeway on this stuff. You either do it correctly or you haven't done it correctly. And I think I'm passing back to you, Claire, if I'm not wrong on the next slide.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Cecilia. And just here, there's a lot of words on this page, but I find it very interesting in Victoria. It's a little bit of language they use that if you, as an organisation, do not know that the person has a current Working with Children check, or see where I've bolded, or is reckless as to that fact, then the penalty supply. Yeah. And one of the things we're discovering is that a lot of organisations are, in my view, reckless as to that fact because they've only checked an accreditation when they've hired someone, and accreditations these accreditations, particularly working with children checks, I can give you the statistics. There's one revoked every day in every state in Australia on average, and more suspended. So, you know, that could be someone in Parliament, it could be someone in a childcare centre, it could be someone anywhere in our community. And as an organisation, I don't think I would want to be standing up in court representing that we had appropriate controls if that person had already been revoked. Their card had already been revoked, but I'd left them in situation in employment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the sort of scary part of the presentation, but there are other reasons why this is so important. Many of you, I'm sure, will have been talking to your insurers. There are a number of insurers leaving the industry in terms of sexual misconduct cover, and those that are staying are expecting a higher standard of protection and risk mitigation. So this is a really great solution. When we talk about how OHO works in this area for you, it's a great solution for demonstrating to auditors, to courts, and to your community that you have adequate risks and controls in place. Next slide, Mel. So what happens when the regulator knocks? And I'm sure Cecilia can add to this, but we have been talking with another legal firm that does a lot of supporting organisations when the regulator comes knocking on the door. And we're increasingly seeing the request for information, so demonstrating controls and controls in accreditation management, site visits, key findings from audits, and obviously, as we've talked about, the penalties. So to be ready, resourcing, policies, procedures, systems, and assumptions are really important to be managing. And let me just talk about policies for a minute. So I too am involved in a number of not-for-profit organisations, and their policies are outstanding. You cannot fault their policies, and it takes a mature board actually and to understand that a policy does not mean an appropriate practice is in place. So I would encourage you as you run your organisations to take those policies down to another level and look at what are my mitigating actions that demonstrate that I'm bringing those policies to life. And OHO is one way to do that in the accreditation space. Next slide. Let me give you a bit of real experience from what we've learned from our customers. As I said, every day in almost all states in Australia, at least one working with children check card is revoked, a medical professional has a restriction placed or a loss of license, a teacher is investigated or suspended. So this is real. 100% of our clients say we have helped them find people they need to remove from access. And our clients tend to be the ones who've been really disciplined in the onboarding, but know that they have to do more than that. And we've still helped them find people. So that tells you that even organisations who are really good at this stuff, the data management and the risk management mitigations and controls that are manual just can't protect you. As I've talked about, we have found 8 red flags leading to stand downs in the last 6 months, and we're only just getting started. The other thing we've found, you will know that with some of the registers, there's a linkage requirement that the employee has to be linked to the organisation. There are linkage failures even in states that have tight processes, and the risk of that is you won't be notified if a card changes.
I don't think people have even been aware of that, Claire.
Yeah.
That's a possibility.
It's a possibility in New South Wales and Queensland and Victoria. They have started to do organisational linking, and a lot of organisations think, oh, well, then I'm covered. But the issue is the database, you know, it doesn't always match, and people come and they go, and so it's still the organisation's responsibility. So if you don't have a linkage in place, you're not going to get notified. OHO automates linkage in a number of states, and we've got more coming for you, so you don't have to worry about that. Data error rates. somewhere between, when we onboard a customer who thinks they've got all the data, somewhere between 30 and 90% error rates. And this is because each state has different data requirements. In some states, you need the date of birth. In some states, you need the middle name. In some states, there's special letters at the end of the code. And you think about everything, everyone's capturing this on a spreadsheet. It's very unlikely to be accurate. And it's not through incompetence, it's actually because it's just really hard to do and not a rewarding task in terms of the mission of organisations. The statistics are pretty awful. This is why we're running this webinar and why we've put the OHO software out. 95% of organisations, in my experience, are not doing any verification beyond onboarding. That is almost all of Australia, with doors open for people to become unsuitable and continue working. We've had people who've stretched expiry dates. The data actually wasn't there in a usable form. We thought we had it, but we actually hadn't collected it. Missing critical information, auditors, fines, insurance restrictions or removal. Here's some of the assumptions though. One that is really very, very common. The assumption is that the registry will tell me. So the Office of the Children's Guardian is going to tell me if there's a problem. Well, actually, the registries are very clear. Their job is to find out whether Claire should have a card or Cecilia should have a card. Their job is not to be checking whether Claire, working in organisation A, is connected or verified. It's the institution's job to be ensuring that all their people are accredited, and they're very clear on their sites that they are not there to be the staff management system or the volunteer management system. So it is an organisational accountability. So that's firstly a myth. The second is the erroneous assumption that our HR systems cover this. Now this happens because we have accreditation modules inside HR where we might store the data, but there's no HR system in Australia. In fact, I don't think there's one globally that goes out and checks those accreditations against the register. So it's almost the equivalent of an Excel spreadsheet in the HR system. Oh, the profoundly naive excuses, Cecilia, I'm sure you've heard some of these over the years. I know we know everybody here. We know everybody here. There'd be no one like that in our organisation. Our worst example of that was all the men are over 65 and they're not interested in sex. You know, profoundly naive. And you know, Grace Tame talks about how pedophiles hide in plain sight and they seek to legitimise themselves. And we're trusting people and we make mistakes in that area. So don't put that obligation on your staff, on your volunteers, just do the checking and that will provide that level of protection.
And have a mature conversation with everyone about what a child-safe culture looks like. It's not about we trust everyone because they're nice. It's about what's acceptable and unacceptable behaviours. And we know that when, particularly with grooming behaviour, you need to stop those preliminary unacceptable behaviours before things escalate. And those rules of what's acceptable and unacceptable apply to everyone, whether they're 65, male, female, whatever. And you ask yourself, why wouldn't you have standards around acceptable behaviour around children and young people? That itself is a red flag sometimes too.
Yes, absolutely. Culture is comes from the top, and if we're not placing value on keeping the doors shut to unsuitable people, then there'll be other issues potentially in the culture. Overwhelmed or disengaged administrative staff with spreadsheets and paper. We have done a survey of parents of children and carers of those with disabilities. They actually think that organisations are doing these checks all the time. Their assumption is that it's done. And so there's this massive disconnect between what the community expects and what's actually going on. And there are massive failures continuing to be reported in the media. And I can read it because I know a lot about this area, but you can tell in most cases that checks were not done. And a very practical example, they did a random audit of the Queensland Fire Service. So they weren't doing ongoing checking, but they did a random audit and they found 200 fireys that needed to be stood down. So that gives you a really compelling example as to why you should be checking on an ongoing basis, because that built up over time and they had enormous access that they shouldn't have had. Let's now shift gears and let's talk a little bit about OHO, and here's Daniel, one of the co-founders, talking about why we set it up. If the sound will run. Unfortunately, we tested it before and it worked.
Always out playing in the dirt, bare feet, making and riding bikes. Parents were nowhere to be seen. It's not the same today. We live in bigger cities with many more people. Technology has massively entered our lives. Community bonds have diminished and trust in our neighbourhoods has weakened. Human nature hasn't changed, but there's just more opportunity for things to go wrong. Children, people with disabilities and others in care are vulnerable to poor practice, or in worse cases to abuse. Government accreditation schemes record the compliance of workers. Compliance with expectations of competency, but also with the expectations of the community. In that sense, government accreditation schemes are a proxy for the good character of workers. And that is why accreditations are so important. Too many employers are unaware of their obligations. Most have substandard systems for administering registrations. They might check a worker when first employed and that's it. They also don't know if a worker who has left the company has been struck off a registry. Abusers don't just strike once. In November 2014, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse began. A close friend and colleague of mine is a survivor. I joined as they took the incredibly brave step of providing a witness statement at that inquiry. That day changed my life, to face the darkest side of humanity and see witness after witness present just one day of the commission that spanned 4 long years. So our team asked ourselves, how could we, a technology consulting business, play our part in stopping abuse and the negligent harm of people in our care? We had to acknowledge that some people will always seek to abuse others, but we can build fences around them. And that's why we created OHO, a system that keeps watch every second of every day. OHO provides continuous validation, rapid notification, expiry management, and evidence of due diligence. It does it all in one place. And any organisation of any size can jump on board. Every Australian should ask the question, how many times is it acceptable for a vulnerable person to be abused? When is it ever okay? Because the answer is never. Be certain.
Great, thanks, Mel. So I'm sure that you're interested in more of the practical details. Let me just really quickly share with you what OHO does. We keep a constant watch on staff and volunteer accreditations and contractors too. If you have a lot of contractors working in your organisation, you also have an accountability to make sure they are safe as well. And as we've talked about, failure to continuously monitor and validate those accreditations beyond the hiring process exposes organisations caring for the vulnerable to predators and malpractice. We have a quick video to show you exactly how it works. Let me also say, just before we jump into that it may seem to manage all of this data, we've talked about a lot of the problems and the challenges, but actually bringing that data into OHO is a very quick process. We've just onboarded a very large disability organisation, and in 4 weeks they had 5,000 people on the system and were immediately in a position where they knew their status on every individual. So please don't be discouraged by the management of the data, and we can also help you collect the data if it's not in the form that it needs to be in. So have have a little look at the video on how it works, and then we'll move to some Q&A.
If you employ people who care for others, you need to know they're qualified, accredited, and safe. Your customers expect you to know, because any incident of abuse is one too many. OHO gives you extra eyes on the safety of your people. We use technology to continuously verify the accreditation of employees, volunteers, and contractors, not just the day they start, but every week of every month of every year. Know your workforce accreditation status at any time by viewing the OHO dashboard. Our technology is continuously monitoring your employee checks. Our notifications alert you automatically and immediately when a worker's accreditation status changes, including if it has been revoked. You'll know when employee registrations are due to expire, so you can notify them and maintain compliance. We provide an auditable, permanent record of checks that's accessible effectively forever. OHO monitors a range of accreditations across different industries, states and territories, and offers a range of integrations, so you can stay up to date in one easy-to-access place. Be certain. Protect your organisation and those in your care. Try it for free at weareoho.com.
You can have a prize for guessing who the voice was on that video, actually. But let me just summarise. Together, we can help prevent abuse. We share a vision of Australia in which every vulnerable person is protected. And by working together, we can make this vision a reality. So thank you for listening. That concludes the content part of the session. Let me just quickly flash up the special offer for Connecting Up members. You get a significant discount of 40% and using the coupon code Connect Up at the checkout or by clicking the link in today's chat window. So, but we're also, number of the team are online today, so we'd be also happy to have a meeting with you and talk through your specific requirements. So let's move to the chat and have a look at questions.
For sure. Thank you so much, Cecilia and Claire. It's wonderful presentations. And then I'm sure there's a lot of takeaway. And wow, there's quite a lot of questions.
Excellent.
So let's start with May. So May is actually having 5 questions altogether, and they're kind of correlated. So it's from the same persons. So, all right. So the first one is how to create policies, and where can I get help to create policies for not-for-profit organizations, which works for community service? For example, organizing community events.
Cecilia, do you want to take that one?
I'm happy to speak to that. Look, we part of what we do is create legally compliant policies. We know of others in the sector who provide some of that content for free, so we've supported some of those bodies over the years to have suitable precedents that you can then tailor to your organisation. Of course, taking on board Claire's point that policies are only the first step, what we would encourage anyone to do who is implementing this is have access to someone who can advise it on getting it right for their organisation. So I should say, and this isn't really a plug, but something that's probably worth noting, we have a phone service for not-for-profits for a flat fee, annual fee. You can ring us as often as you like. We're very conscious of the reality of budget constraints in this sector. You don't have to have us prepare your policies and procedures, but you might just like to have us at the end of the phone.
Yeah, thank you. And I have seen a lot of collaboration between organisations in the not-for-profit sector around policies, because these policies are foundational pieces. They don't they enable your mission, but they're not giving away intellectual property or the special skills that you have in your mission. So you can also find that other organisations are very willing to share if they've put some effort into their policies. Next question, Jean. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble actually seeing the questions in the chat, so I'm going to need you to ask them.
Yeah, I can assign the questions to you, or I can just ask to make it easier. So
Let's
the next
just,
question.
yeah.
Okay. So from the same persons. So which policies or procedures we should have?
Wow, that's a huge question.
That is a huge
Related to
question.
the previous one.
I might quickly jump in there, Claire. If you have to have, and absolutely have to have, a child safe policy and a child safe code of conduct. If you don't have those two, you are undoubtedly non-compliant. But that's the starting point only. And obviously there are policies and procedures, you might speak to these, Claire, around these key critical processes of checks, onboarding and ongoing verification. Claire?
Yeah. Personally, I wouldn't. This to me is a foundational piece. If you're letting people into your organisation or letting them become unsuitable while they're working for you and not doing anything about it, then I think you're massively exposed. So I think auditors and you know, the regulators would look favourably upon if you've got really good foundational controls as to who gets to work in your organisation, and then you can start to mature into some of the more complex areas around culture, around training, around and the most recent probably development in this area has been helping children have the courage and the safe space to speak up. And that actually, you know, touches on a nerve for me, because I think it's absolutely unacceptable for a child to have to speak up about someone who shouldn't have been in the organisation in the first place. And so let's get those controls in place, and then we can talk to children and encourage children to speak up about things that they're seeing that they're not comfortable with. So there are a number of elements. Personally, I would invest in the foundational piece first, and then that will give you the space to invest in with confidence in the other components.
Lovely, thank you for that. All right, so Claire, I assigned the questions to you, but I'll just ask the questions so that everyone will know the questions.
Yeah.
All right, so does the whole board member need to hold working with children check? They won't be directly working with children, but they may interact with children while the children are present at the event. For example, like dance practice.
Yeah, in most states it is compulsory that all those office bearers, official office bearers, and the reason, if you look back through some of the cases in the Institutional Royal Commission, the directors were actually told on a number of occasions about unacceptable behaviour, but did nothing. And so, and maybe in some cases that was malicious because they had personal, you know, issues in their own lives, but it is the board that is held accountable for hiring the people in the organisation. So this is really a principle around, well, if the office bearers of the organisation who are hiring the CEO, who then hires all the other people, if they're not okay, then how can you have a culture that actually prioritises child safety? Now, the only exception, and we're navigating this a bit, and Cecilia might have some views, the only state that we've had a little bit of difficulty with in this area is New South Wales. And we are finding that the Office of the OCG has or somewhere in the legislation is a requirement that you work with children 49% of the time. And that definition is causing some elements of the registration process in New South Wales not to be done. But broadly across Australia, it is absolutely mandatory that the office bearers hold these accreditations.
Yes, and I would add to your excellent observations there, Claire. If you do go back to the Royal Commission, it was again that naive view of, oh, well, we don't need to worry about them because they don't see kids. Well, if you are a person who is motivated to commit abuse, you're the very person who's going to find their way around those systems. It might just be at that barbecue once a year that you go to. All of the other staff have been checked, but you're just a volunteer, you're just a board member, no one knows who you are, and guess what? The opportunity is at the barbecue, and 90% of the abuse is opportunistic. So there's no exceptions for people who you think maybe don't have contact with kids. They are, as Claire says, mainly covered.
Yeah.
Mainly required to have it.
Jean?
All right, thank you very much. And okay, so she's also asking, I think many of us will be interested, who can do the internal audits without any fees, as we are not for profit organization. What do you think?
So the internal audit, in a way, OHO is an internal audit for you in this area, because we offer a permanent record of the checks that you've undertaken. So remember, we talked about every week of every month of every year. If all your employees and volunteers are in the OHO system, and you'll find it's a very small cost for the peace of mind, that's your internal audit, and that will protect you if the external regulators come. And it's we've set it up deliberately because there was a lot of you'll remember in the Royal Commission there was a lot of records altered and people's unsuitability was hidden away and taken out of the files and all that kind of stuff. This is set up on a piece of technology that allows it to be evident if somebody's tampered with it. And so this gives you that internal audit protection for a very low cost, and then that is something you'll be able to show the external auditors and regulators should they come and see you. One of our customers actually said they passed their audit with flying colours because OHO was in place, and the auditor was absolutely ecstatic.
If you are scrambling to put together documentation that you should have had when the regulator comes, it's too late already.
Yeah.
I will simply say you should have had this. You shouldn't be developing it. You shouldn't have to be hunting for stuff. You shouldn't be having to have emergency board meetings to pass policies that you should have had 5 years ago. You're already in trouble if you're in that situation.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. And all right, so she's also asking, if something goes wrong in the organization, who's the person responsible for the whole organization? Is that board members or only compliance officer? Talking about responsibility.
Well, it's a tough job for the compliance officer if the board and the CEO are not taking responsibility in this area. And, you know, my counsel to the compliance officer would be go and find another job, because it would be extremely difficult to have a strong safety culture and a strong compliance culture in any of these industries. They're people-based industries, and that is one of the major risks in running our organisations, and that's why there's been royal commissions and all of that stuff, because unfortunately when people get together they don't always behave the way they should. So it is absolutely the responsibility. The compliance officer can help facilitate directors and CEOs to have visibility of their execution of those responsibilities. And I should just mention that OHO produces a board report that you're able to then just table every month with directors, and that can give them a sense of whether the compliance is at the level it needs to be, and also they can monitor its improvement over time. So there are ways for compliance managers to lift the standard, but it will come down to culture, and if the directors and the CEO are committed to it, which they should be, and if they're not, personally, I would recommend that the compliance officer considers looking for an organisation where those values are really, really important.
Thank you for this. So I hope that answers all of your questions, May. We have another audience, Lee, asking another questions. So would you please, do you have any advice about NGOs who runs education overseas, plus having small workforce in Australia and don't seem to fit in child-related work in Australia?
Yes, good question, because World Vision was very much in that situation where they had a workforce here in Australia, but most of the work was carried on in other countries. And you will know from some of the press that there's been a whole clean out in the international aid industry, because there were very unacceptable behaviours. You know, sex for aid essentially was the title, the name of what was going on. And so it is just as important that you check, despite your people working overseas, that you check your own staff and that they are safe to work. The challenges in developing nations, of course, are when you're hiring local people. And in some of those countries, they don't have the level of maturity that we have in terms of working with children check systems and accreditation management. Identity is one of the big challenges there. However, if your own people, and this, you know, through many high profile aid organisations, they had Westerners misusing their authority and their right to support developing nations. Get your own house in order as quickly as you can, and then it comes down to those people encouraging a safe culture in the countries where they work. Very good question.
We've helped some overseas aid organisations too, and it's so complicated sometimes with cultural difference. So what we'd love to do, I'm sure I'm speaking for you too here, Claire, is make sure the conversation is around misuse of power and unacceptable behaviours. If we believe, or we speak as if we think this is about sex or sexual relationships, it's a complete misunderstanding of what abuse actually is. Abuse is about power, and the more that we empower those people who are vulnerable, and in fact we are now required to do that by the Child Safe Standards, the better it will be. And that applies for overseas aid as well. Gone are the days of that benevolent sort of paternalistic approach to aid. If we're not there helping those folks become empowered, it's really the wrong lens.
Yeah.
Great, wonderful. All right, so we got another good question here. So you mentioned getting started is easy. So what's the minimum data required to get started with AHER? Our organization is working with children checks only.
Yeah, look, the minimum, we have a format that's available on the website for how to get your data ready to go into the system. And you can upload it in bulk. And you know, the model is there as long as you can get it into that spreadsheet, but also our team's here to help. We can help you get it into that shape, but that is really all that's required, is an Excel spreadsheet with the data, with the right fields, and we guide you through that process and upload it into the system, and you can be, as I like to say, live by lunchtime and know where you stand on this risk.
Lovely. So I just post the link onto the chat so all the audience can see the link now. You can just click on the link, or we'll just send you a follow-up email with the presentation deck today plus the recordings. So this link will appear in that email as well if you couldn't get this one now. So yeah, thank you for this. All right, so let's see if we got another questions.
The other thing, while you're doing that, Jean, I'll just mention there is also a risk assessment tool on our website that goes into a little bit more detail and asks you how you're managing this risk, and it will help you work out what interventions you need to take.
Lovely, thank you for that. So no worries, we'll give you some additional links, informations after the webinar. So we'll send everything in 1 to 2 business days. Okay, so we got a questions here. We have heard there's some changes coming to child safe standard in Victoria. So what specifically the changing, and what kind of how would a tool like a whole can assist us in such a change?
Do you want to talk to that first, Cecilia?
Yep, I'll speak briefly to that. We already have child safe standards, but they are being effectively supercharged with effect from July. There are standards around increased empowerment of young people, consultation with family, greater recognition of the vulnerability of Indigenous folks. But I would say that for the purposes of this chat, the responsibilities are now unequivocal. You must have the ability to check the suitability of people on an ongoing basis. That is firmly within the standards. It's not a nice to have, it's a must to have. Did you want to add something new, Claire?
Yeah, just that if you look at the paperwork that they've sent out, or the actual upgrade to the standards, it's number 6.2, where it says they must have a current working with children check. And there's only one way to know that, and that's by checking every week.
Great, thank you for this. Okay, it looks like we got the last questions here. So Janae is asking, our charity hosts camps for children across Australia, and our office is based in Victoria, but understand workers and volunteers must have their current WWCC relevant to their residential address, no matter which state they are. So which state would have the highest level of compliance? And should we aim to meet those standards?
That's
Well,
so complicated question. Go on, Claire.
It's a very good question, and it comes down to how, in some ways it's a bit cultural and what importance the organisation is placing on this area. But if they're sending people into other states to work, the first thing is to make their home check safe. But some states will require you to register separately. Not all states do this, but so we do have some clients where their staff and volunteers have multiple working with children checks depending on which states they're working in. Again, we can cater for that, but we can also provide that demonstration that the home check is valid. Do you want to take the second part of the question, Cecilia?
I think the question was who's at the highest standard. Well, probably Victoria. Victoria has the highest standard in most of these things, but I would just say it doesn't mean that it's compliant. I understand the agony that national organisations have because we have a whole bunch of different obligations. What we can't say is that if you do what you have required to do in Victoria for everyone, you're covered, because there are additional obligations in other states. Your question can be complicated, particularly when you consider that some of your staff may be interacting with kids online, but they may not meet them, and they will be engaged in child-related work. Or if you're doing it under education, maybe even child-connected work, which is a lower bar in many ways. So, yes, Victoria has a high standard, but I think Claire is so right in that saying you need to just step it through what states they need to be accredited in.
Yeah, and I would just share, I forget the name of the person who asked the question, but we do have a camping organisation on OHO, and I'm sure they would be open to having a chat to you about some of the things that they've learnt, because we do recognise the sessional nature of camps and volunteers in those contexts. So let us know if you'd like us to assist you with that.
Lovely, thank you very much. And Janae is just saying thank you so much to both of you. So I believe it really helps. All right, so that's pretty much for the questions today. Thank you so much, Cecilia and Claire, for these wonderful sections. And so before we finish up, do you have any things you would like to add?
Well, just to thank you for your engagement and the really insightful questions, and we do hope that you will take this risk very seriously, and we'd love to chat to you to see if OHO can help you do that in a really easy way. Thank you.
Great,
Bye.
thank you very much. Yeah, please. All right, so before we finish, I guess most of you are seeing my screen now. So it's our next coming up webinar, the Futures one. So if you would like to learn about something apart from compliance, but you would like to learn something about like marketing and fundraising, it's a very great opportunity coming up. So there's a growing and thriving Facebook group for fundraising and support. It's on the 22nd February, that's next week. So $50 each. With the Facebook fundraising, it's basically 90 minutes, covers a lot of things that you would like to know. It's definitely a very practical step-by-step webinars that helps you to know and understand about how to use Facebook in order to have a much better fundraising results. So if you're interested, feel free to go to our websites under the training. So we have the upcoming webinars, and there's a lots of different kinds of events you'll see. But of course, we'll also put these down in the follow-up email so that if you're interested, you can just register through that. All right, thank you very much again. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Cecilia. I'm sure we'll see you next very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.